Ladies and gentlemen, today the subject of my speech is Whitlam, economic rationalism and Australia's survival. What is Gough Whitlam? Is he a minority group revolutionary, as were Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky and many or most of their acolytes in Russia, or a committed Fabian socialist with possible, perhaps apparent, communist sympathies, or both? Before I expound Whitlam, please allow me to establish a strategic background. Australia today is facing an increasingly threatening strategic environment in the Asian Pacific area. Apart from China, Australia should be assessing its future defence and security in relation to a Muslim Indonesia, which is very close to us but also can control the vital sea lanes and access to trade to our north. The circumstances in this regard are ominous. An already desperately overcrowded Indonesian population will grow from 246.9 million people in 2012 to an estimated 306 million by 2050. It is also estimated that by 2050 Indonesia's economy will be the fourth largest in the world, and its manufacturing industry is growing at up to 7% per annum. Moreover, the Indonesians struggle to exist on a volcanic, seismically unstable island or islands, in total 1/4 the size of Australia. Australia is obviously potentially a prize for Asian countries from our north, under pressure, seeking living space and agricultural and mineral resources. In this regard, one might be aware of a reported, although not independently verified, speech by Chi Haotian, the Minister for Defence and Vice Chairman of China's Central Military Commission, in August 2005. The purported speech declared the Chinese Communist Party's intended strategy of conquering America using biological warfare and forcibly seeking living space in the USA, Canada and Australia. As part of the speech, the results of a survey taken were declared, to the effect that 80% of the Chinese respondents to the survey would be prepared to kill women, children and prisoners of war in the event of war with Western nations. You might refer to Google under "War is the Midwife" for this speech. However, China surely will not have to invade Australia, because it can take control of this country as a result of the incompetence, irresponsibility and self-interest of our politicians and bureaucrats. A country's first line of defence is a strong economy, and Australia's leaders, both politicians and bureaucrats as well as business leaders, have been presiding over the demise of our economy through application of neoliberal or economic rationalist policies, which are driving the economy from underdeveloped to undeveloped status. Thus, The Economist magazine was able to state a couple of years ago that Australia is effectively a third world country with a first world standard of living. As one insightful commentator has charged, economic rationalists, like communists, never let facts get in the way of their ideology. At the outset, it should be mentioned that it was not the extreme deregulatory free market policies of the neoliberals, but interventionist, including protectionist policies, which were the foundation of the extraordinary successes of the pre-First World War German and American economies. Such policies have also been applied by the Southeast and East Asian economies, with the exception of Hong Kong, which has unique historical characteristics as an entrepot, in accomplishing their economic miracles during the 20th century. After approximately 1980, all of Europe, except Britain, followed the German protectionist lead, and continental GNP and trade volume increased greatly as a result. At the same time, Britain, under a continuation of free trade policies, went into comparative economic decline. Whitlam's 1973 25% across-the-board tariff cut was effectively the start of the application of neoliberal or economic rationalist policies in Australia, although it came here and to New Zealand like a virus from Britain via Canada and the USA more momentously during the 1980s. Anglo-Celtic societies seem particularly vulnerable to it, perhaps because, like the Australian Labor Party's Fabian socialism, largely responsible for Lenin's 1917 triumph in Russia, and the succeeding 70 years of international communism, it came from the mother country. On the 18th of July 1973, Whitlam and Trade and Industry Minister Jim Cairns asked Cabinet to cut all tariff protection of industry immediately by 25% as a means of restraining inflation. Inflation increased from 5.4% per annum as per the CPI in the December quarter 1972 to 13.2% a year later, fueled by high wages growth under the then centralised system of wage fixing with comparative wage justice, reckless expenditure by the Whitlam government, rising commodity prices and the stagflation, that is, increasing inflation and unemployment together, resulting from the OPEC oil price shock of 1973. By 1974, inflation was 16.3% annually. This tariff cut was the most momentous of all the policy decisions made by the Whitlam government, but although 874 departmental decisions were transmitted frenetically to Cabinet in 1973, no submission at all was made in respect of this fateful decision. The rationale for the tariff cut was that it would stimulate imports to relieve shortages of supplies and therefore also restrain prices. This was a long-term decision affecting the structure of the economy, wrongly chosen to address a short-term problem, and unbelievably without reference to Treasury Department. Mr. John Stone was the good guy in the story, Deputy Secretary of Treasury at the time, and he wrote a memorandum endorsing lower tariffs as a goal, but arguing that an immediate indiscriminate cut while leaving heavily protected sectors unharmed would destroy more vulnerable firms. The results of the tariff cut were that in 1972-73, Australia recorded its last current account surplus. A year later, import volumes increased by 1/3 and current account deficits became permanent. Manufacturing lost 138,000 jobs in 2 years, and high unemployment became entrenched in Australia. But the tariff cut was not simply a decision made with respect to restraint of inflation. Whitlam regarded the existing tariff structures as economically inefficient, inequitable and against the national interest, and he argued that the tariff reduction would stimulate greater efficiencies in the Australian economy to make it more competitive internationally. That Whitlam was an economic rationalist was confirmed when he later sacked Jim Cairns as party treasurer, and Cairns subsequently revealed that a major reason for his sacking was that he disagreed with Whitlam's economic rationalism. Whitlam's tremendous ego and his incompetence and recklessness with regard to economic policy and government generally are disclosed by his following statements. In his memoirs in 1985, page 184, it is fair comment that my own preoccupation and predilections lay beyond the narrower field of economic theory. In the 1961 speech, socialists are now more concerned with the creation of opportunities than the imposition of restraints. Within our own nation, we do not have to ration scarcity but plan abundance. In the 1972 policy speech, Whitlam asserted that Labour's big spending programs would be paid for by the automatic and inevitable massive growth in Commonwealth revenues. Whitlam's statements fit perfectly the irresponsibility and stupidity concerning economic policy making by Australia's leaders during the 1960s and early 1970s. 1. Because of the resources boom, influential policymakers decided that Australia's manufacturing industry was largely dispensable. The anticipated increase in mineral export earnings to allow a much higher proportion of manufactured goods to be provided through imports. 2. Whitlam's economic rationalism was apparently also incited by the neoliberal rationalism of the Tariff Board, which was later followed by the Whitlam government's creation, the Industries Assistance Commission, then the Industry Commission, and finally by the present Productivity Commission. All these subsequent commissions followed destructive and often ruthless economic rationalist policies. 3. Effectively, these economic rationalist policies started a radical experiment to remove all protection from Australian industry, with the intention that competitive pressure from the international markets would force Australian industry generally either to match or perish. 4. Australian industry, both manufacturing and agricultural, has been perishing ever since, and the country has run deeply into debt. The most profound chapter in the story of Australian economic rationalism, however, came with the neoliberal revolution under Hawke and Keating in the 1980s. These two Labour Party leaders impetuously deregulated the whole Australian economy, floated the exchange rate in 1983, and removed controls on international capital flows.